welcome to the second Doing Gender lecture of our series for this year, which is also the first lecture of 2022. The Doing Gender lecture series is organized by the Netherlands Research School of Gender Studies in cooperation with all its partners. And as you know, it specifically focuses on the many ways in which gender plays a role and is concretely involved in interdisciplinary research in theory and practice. And today we have the pleasure to virtually host, unfortunately virtually host Amah Edoh. Amah is assistant professor of anthropology and African studies at MIT, where she also got her PhD from the program in history, anthropology, and science, technology, and society in 2016. So Amah is a cultural anthropologist whose research focuses on the construction and the meaning of African being in the world, or Africanness, both on the continent and among African diasporas across the world. And Amah is particularly interested in researching how these processes of construction of Africanness develop through the design and the crafting of material objects and commodities. Her previous research focused on textile, and it has a particular connection with the Netherlands. I mean, we will hear more later in our talk, since Amah has been investigating and exploring the production of and the circulation of Dutch wax cloth, or African print cloth. It was produced in the Netherlands for West African markets. But Amah is also the co-director and the co-founder, together with Liliane Moubier, who is a transitional justice expert and a legal sociologist, of the African Futures Action Lab. And I mean, you can tell more about this project, but the African Futures Action Lab are just an incredible platform that they've been creating for putting academic knowledge on the service of activists and advocacy groups that are engaged in issues of racial justice and reparations. So Amah and I shared quite a lot of interest together, and we were actually planning to organize in person not only today's Doing Gender lecture, but also the European launch of the African Futures Action Lab. That was not possible, clearly, because of the COVID restrictions, so we decided to cancel and reschedule the event in late spring. We didn't set up a date for now, but the idea is that we will have Amah in person with Liliane in Utrecht, and we will do this European launch of the African Futures Action Lab later. So now, before I just leave the floor to Amah, I would say the title of today's talk, which is of Grandmothers, Mama Benzes, and Afropolitans, Black Women, and African Becoming on Dutch Wax Clothes Rail. So Amah, I'll leave it to you. Take your time, and then we'll have time for discussion and for your questions. Just the floor is yours, Amah. Thank you so much for being with us.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that introduction, Jamila, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I was very much looking forward to being with you all in person. Alas, Omicron had other plans, but I'm glad that we're still able to make this happen virtually nonetheless. So as Jamila mentioned in the introduction, this is research that I did. It was my dissertation research, and it's kind of like my first book in progress. And it connects, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, it connects to the work that I'm more actively engaged in right now also, which has got to do with reparative justice. And so because I've been sort of imbued in this reparative justice work right now, it's sort of feeding my thinking about and my reflection on this research that I did several years ago. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to draw out some of those connections in the talk today. All right, so I'm not very familiar with Teams, so we're gonna cross our fingers and make sure everything goes well. So are you seeing, oh no, I'm not sharing my screen with you all right now. So are you seeing my screen now? Is this, you seeing the PowerPoint? Perfect. All right, so as Jamila mentioned in the intro also, the concern at the heart of both my research and my talk today is Africa's place in the world. And by that, I mean the rank that Africa and Africans occupy, you know, in the global order, and how that's negotiated by, in particular, by a range of social actors. And, you know, as we all know, right, and as scholars like Valentin Mudimbe and Nashin Bembe have theorized, within this kind of global world order, Africa is historically ranked at the bottom of the hierarchy and has figured as the ultimate other, right? So not just at the bottom of the hierarchy, but kind of embodying otherness. And so what I was interested with this research, it's funny to think about this research as almost historical at this point, because it's been, it's been what, 8 years since well, not even, I think since the time I started thinking about it, it's been properly 10 years, because it was 2011. But this time, if you can remember that far back, was a moment where the dominant narrative, or the mainstream narrative about Africa, seemed to be shifting from, and this is the juxtaposition that I imagine many of you have seen, from the story of Africa as a hopelessly pathological and dysfunctional continent, to a story of a hopeful Africa, right, which is often referred to as Africa Rising. And so this was a kind of a shift in discourse that started, in the early 2010s and kind of lasted right up until the pandemic, where discourses kind of very swiftly seemed to swing right back to sort of hopeless Africa. And maybe that's something we can talk about later. And at this time, really, I'm curious about how visible this was from you all's vantage point in the Netherlands, but certainly this was an important part, certainly in France and in Africa and in sort of American publications, also these new stories about Africa in the world. Now, the object that I take up to think about this question, right, about Africa's place in the world, was this cloth, as Jamila mentioned, which is known by many names. And the generic names are wax cloth, right, which has got to do with how it is printed as a with using a resist dyeing technique. It's also known as African print cloth. And I was focusing specifically on the Dutch-made variety of this cloth, which is known as Dutch wax cloth, or as Hollandais. Because even though this cloth was introduced to Africa in the late 19th century by Scottish merchants, and then over the years, manufacturers from France, from Switzerland, from the Netherlands, from Japan even, eventually joined them, the sole remaining European manufacturer of this cloth is the Helmond-based Dutch company VLSCO. And this brand, the Dutch wax cloth, this VLSCO's Dutch wax cloth brand, is considered widely the most valuable variety and the most highly valued variety of wax cloth in the market today, even if it doesn't represent the most important in volume, right? In sort of in historical and cultural value, it's the most significant. In Togo, which is where my family is from, and which is where I also conducted the other part of my research, because my research tracked a collection of cloth from design in the Netherlands and the creation of advertising campaigns so design in Helmond, and then the creation of advertising campaigns in VLSCO's marketing department in Amstelveen at the time. On to Togo, which was a historical hub for the cloth's distribution throughout West and Central Africa, where I looked at selling and buying and tailoring and wearing. So the idea was focusing on the various practices along the cloth's path from conception to use, to understand how this Africanness was being produced and negotiated. In Togo, and these are pictures from my mother's personal collection, the cloth is known in the main language, Mina, as Chiganvo, which means high value cloth or high price cloth. And the most iconic prints are often referred to as Nyamamao Bavo, which means our grandmother's cloth. Here's my grandmother. These names highlight the high degree of economic, cultural, and affective value that this cloth, a European import to West Africa, has come to hold in Togo, certainly, but across West and Central Africa more widely, and arguably across African diasporas also, where it has come to mark cultural and racial pride. Now, why is Dutch wax cloth an interesting object with which to think about Africa's place in the world at that particular historical juncture? And what does all of this have to do with gender, right, or with doing gender? First, it's because at that particular moment in time when I was conducting this research, VLSCO was in the midst of rebranding itself from a manufacturer of textiles for Africa into a global luxury and fashion design brand. And by doing that, they were hoping to reach markets beyond Africa, both with cloth, but also with other products derived on one hand from the company's design handwriting, right? And also, on the other hand, from the high value that its products had come to hold in Africa. In other words, the task the company was undertaking was to translate or to convert the Chigonvo high value into luxury high value for a global market. And so, as you can imagine, this offered, a prime opportunity for considering how the categories of African and global were being defined, and how they were relating to one another, how they were enacted, how they were translated into material forms. One of the things that emerged as particularly, I'd say, thorny during my research and in my thinking about it since then has been the place of Black women's bodies, specifically Black African women's bodies, in the articulation of these categories of the African and the global. And so especially I've been kind of, and I'll talk about this a lot, but kind of taken with the representations of these bodies in communications of that era, the ways that their presence and their absence, or how we might read kind of the conditions for their visibility, and what all of that revealed about the negotiation of African inclusion in the global. So unsurprisingly, right, women's bodies were in a critical site where this negotiation was being played out, not only because this was a textile company that whose primary consumers are women, but also for all the ways that we know that the labor of Black African women has played into the workings of racial capitalism for the past several centuries. So today I'm talking more about bodies than about cloth, right? But I'm talking about bodies that are adorned with this cloth. I'm talking about bodies in place, bodies in space, all along this trajectory between the Netherlands and West Africa. And I guess the core question I'm asking is, what bodies are allowed or imaginable in the global, right? Basically, that's what's at the heart of the question. And what does this reveal about the negotiation of Africa's place in the world in this Africa Rising moment? Now, there's a way that place typically comes up in conversations about Dutch wax cloth or about African print cloth. And that is a question about, well, what kind of thing is it? Is this cloth African or is it European? And honestly, in and of itself, that's a debate that I just don't find very productive or interesting, because once we consider that consumption is an important site of value production, then a European-made African object is no longer incongruous. But the thing is that there is a question under that question. And that the question under the question of, well, what kind of thing is it, is a question about power, especially when the question is asked by African and Afro-descended folks. Because the real question, as I hear it, under the question of, well, what kind of thing is it? Is it African or is it European? Is a question about, well, what are we to make of this object given its historical roots and the colonial legacies it embodies? Right? It's a question that is all the more poignant that the cloth marks Black and African cultural identity and pride in a political order undergirded by white supremacy and anti-Blackness, right? So when, given that this cloth has been taken up, and here I have a picture of Maya Angelou, the American poet and writer, on one hand, who famously moved to Ghana in the 60s and wore, has a lot of pictures where she's wearing African print cloth. And these are designs that were printed by VLSCO and other companies. And then on the other hand, these pictures that I just found online when Black Panther was coming out of, I don't know what it was like in Europe, but in the US at that time, there was a whole phenomenon among Black folks going to watch Black Panther in African garb, right? And a lot of that involved African print cloth. Now, here, this is not VLSCO, this is not Dutch wax cloth per se, but it is wax cloth. And so to me, these images really embody the way that this cloth goes into a performance of racial pride in a way that is really about, it's about resistance, right? It's about pushing back against this kind of dominant system of white supremacy. And so you can imagine that when you realize that, well, this thing that I thought I was wearing that marked sort of political autonomy, in fact, is made in Europe and designed by white people, then it's like, well, damn, like what do I make of this object, right? It kind of feels like the joke is on you. So there's this kind of question about power that's at the heart of it. that I think is really important and really interesting. And that question is a question that pulls the past into the present, that asks us to reckon with the ways that the histories of colonialism and slavery continue to shape our present realities. In this case, in the form of trade relationships or networks and consumer goods. And this is a picture from the VLSCO archives of the founder of the company on a market research trip in West Africa. I don't even want to lie about the exact time period. I don't have it in my notes right now. And so this question about how the histories of colonialism and slavery continue to shape our present realities, now that's a critical question that is central to the current debates, right, about the place that is afforded considerations and repair for the historical injustices of colonialism and slavery in contemporary movements for racial justice. As I was saying earlier, my work of date has focused more on these questions of reparative justice, and I'm seeing more and more the ways that these projects, both on waxcloth and on reparative justice, mutually illuminate one another, or maybe how they point to the same underlying questions. Because if we consider that the foundation for transatlantic slavery and colonialism was first the dehumanization and then the articulation of a racial hierarchy that, systematically othered Black Africans, then we see that this line of inquiry points back to the same concerns as the debates about reparations today, right? We're talking about the legacies and the afterlives of colonialism or slavery and how they manifest in contemporary realities and experience. And so the case of waxcloth, I think, really just provides some concrete, examples, gives us a sense of the kind of concrete material realities or manifestations of these dynamics. So I organize the talk in three places, in three portions. Out of place. So when I think back to my fieldwork at VLSCO, the kind of what sticks with me is the memory of the walls at the company. This is from their exhibit at the Dutch Design Week, not actually within the company, because there were, you weren't permitted to take photos inside the company because of fears of industrial espionage. But the walls were covered with images of the company's advertising campaigns. And so on one hand, that these images of these walls really stand out to me, or maybe it's more the feeling of being in that space and looking up at the walls that really stays with me. And I think they stand out to me because at the time of my research, I was often the only Black person in that physical space, right? And so seeing images of Black women on walls and spaces occupied almost exclusively by white people made me uncomfortable. And it was quite jarring to be in the space that was dedicated to producing consumer goods geared towards a Black African market without actually having Black African people in that space. In fact, one evening when I was conducting field work in Amstelveen, I stayed at work later than usual after a lot of the members of the team had left and the cleaning team arrived, and the housekeeper came up to the floor I was sitting, and it was when I saw her that I realized, oh my God, she's the only Black person I've seen in days, right? Being in this space. And so, kind of the kind of jarring experience of being immersed in, on one hand, these images of Black bodies and Black women on the walls, and these fabrics that I grew up with and that are part of my very kind of personal kind of experience and so my family and national identity, all these things. On one hand, that was jarring to not actually have to be in an all-white space where these also very intimate objects were always visible. But I think part of what was jarring about it also was knowing or kind of traveling with the awareness of the ways that Black bodies and Black female bodies in particular have been treated and sort of have existed in the European imaginary, right? So knowing that, kind of having this constant awareness that Black bodies, excuse me, and Black female bodies in particular in white spaces are never neutral. And so this, so I think this is part of what was shaping my, or kind of informing how I moved or how I experienced that space. Now, as I think about that, a moment that was particular, that stands out in my memory is the 2014 Dutch Design Week, which happened in Eindhoven. And there was a day when I was making my way between the site of the VLSCO exhibit and the train station. And I was met with this image, which is from one of VLSCO's advertising campaigns at the time, or just it had happened just before, a little while before the exhibit. And again, it felt quite odd and unsettling to have this massive image of this Black woman wearing wax prints in this space, in this landscape where the Black bodies were far and few between. The Dutch Design Week in Eindhoven was happening at a time where across Europe, really, the waxcloth had become increasingly conspicuously visible on the European commercial landscape more broadly. These are some images that I took in Paris at around the same time, where there'd been a whole lot of attention to waxcloth at the Galerie Lafayette. There was this Africa Now campaign, and it was like waxcloth everything, all the time, everywhere. And it was this sort of like new Africa. All of a sudden, this object has value, and Africa has value. This a small shop I just ran into in the 18th arrondissement in Paris. I don't know if you can make out in the picture very well, but there are all these turbans that are being sold cut out of waxcloth also in this very kind of bobo, not at all. It's not a space that's occupied, let's say, by a lot of Black or African bodies. So this new visibility, was fed by the new story of Africa, and also fed the new story of Africa, this Africa rising. And it seemed to, suggest a new recognition and a revaluing of African cultural production in Western markets, but not without the attendant discomforts, right? So was this revaluing or upvaluing to be trusted? And what was really being revalued? Was it African culture production and objects? Was it Africans? Which of course is at the heart of debates about the cultural appropriation of Black cultural forms by dominant cultures, right? To what extent does the uptake of an appreciation and upvaluing of the cultural forms actually translate into an upvaluing of the people and cultures that produce them? I was in the metro in Paris around that time, and I saw a woman carrying this tote, and I'm usually quite shy about asking strangers to take pictures of them, but it was just too good. I just had to, so I asked her, and thankfully she humored me. But I love this tote. I saw it, and I was like, wax is the new Black. I felt like this is so interesting, and felt like there was something going on here. And I was thinking about it. I think what captured me about it is I think it really captured for me, I don't know what the designers intended, right? But what it captured for me was the ambivalence of that moment. And I think it captures it quite succinctly, because to me, I see this and I think, okay, if we think about Blackness as sort of being at the bottom of this sort of hierarchy, right, of the global order, and then Blackness becoming cool, kind of Black cultural forms becoming cool. When you think about wax, sort of being the new Black, and wax figuring or marking Africanness, right? And now wax being the new Black, wax becoming cool, Africa becoming cool. To me, sort of the statement of wax is the new Black points to there was a commentary on the instability or the slipperiness of the status and mainstream acceptance or recognition for Black bodies and cultural forms, right? This recognition that these categories, to me, because I'm curious to hear how other people read it, but like the fact that these categories, are slippery, and then, of course, there's a whole other analysis to be made about kind of it being co-opted into or kind of commodified and so on. But to me, it points to this question about what to make of the status that waxcloth was occupying at that time and what it was saying about Africa and the world. Now, VLSCO's creative director held that the company's advertising images did the very opposite of exotification, right? Because they adopted the aesthetic of luxury fashion. And so for him, the images were democratizing, they were equalizing, in a sense, they were normalizing for the African bodies they depicted and for Africa in general. They rendered Black African women in a new idiom, different from the trope of the poor, starving, disease-ridden African, and showed that, as he put it, Africans can do fashion too. And this is a stance that permeated the company, at least the parts where I conducted research, the design and branding departments. And there was a strong sense that the company's mission was to serve its African women consumers, that the commitment to doing good design demonstrated respect towards these consumers. Whereas Africa was perceived in the white Western popular imaginary as a place where cast-offs are sent, right? Whether out of charity or disdain. By designing and printing a high-quality product geared towards African consumers, they demonstrated that African consumers were not only deserving, but also discriminating. And so to the extent that one of the sites where the dehumanization of Black and African people has played out has been the question of taste and discrimination, VLSCO's commitment to producing high quality products and branding them as luxury could be read as a form of rehumanizing Black African people and women in particular. This was a kind of the dominant argument at the company. And so if we think as exotification as a form of objectification, then the folks at VLSCO saw themselves as doing exactly the opposite of that. And this is an image from a campaign that I'll be fully honest with you, I just found it again this morning. I was like, oh, this is perfect, because this is kind of the images that accompany the new collections of designs. And what I love about this image is that this woman is clad in a new VLSCO design. In the picture, she's climbing stairs. She's holding a key, right? And there are keys dangling at the very top of the stairs, if you see at the top right. At the bottom, you have the hand of a designer, right? Someone drawing. And so, quite powerfully, this image kind of embodies this thing about this wearing, this being adorned of this luxury brand and this textile, offering a key for ascendance and access, right? And this kind of access, but at the same time, the access that might be represented as a key is always sort of dangling in the future without being fully attainable. To me, this really, really captures the dynamics that I'm trying to think about here. And so for me, what's interesting also is that, okay, on one hand, yes, maybe these images, let's say we're going to talk about it a little bit more, but maybe these images do kind of give us a different picture of Africa and of African women. But you know what? If we think about the specificities of who is pictured in these images, right, of which Black African women bodies are featured in these luxury images, in my view, when you look at that, you realize that these images actually reify the negative tropes that the branding sought to distance itself from, and that these images are in fact not subversive at all of dominant discourses. Why? So across the campaigns, the campaign images, the models featured are young, thin, have straightened hair. And these are all decisions that are made in the branding department in keeping with the standards of the luxury and fashion industries at the time, which was a few years before, more inclusive fashion became more popular, right? Before it's kind of part of mainstream discussions. And in one particularly memorable campaign planning meeting that I attended, the branding team discussed market research feedback on past campaigns, where customers from Nigeria, I think it was, had complained about not seeing themselves represented in VLSCO's branding images. Namely, they were asking to see more fat women and older women. A senior team member empathized with these customers' complaint and drew out the predicament that the company was finding itself in, as it sought to both stay connected to its core consumers by reflecting their preferences and also to put forward a new brand identity. She said, "You can't put the Maggie Lady on the board and call yourself a luxury brand." The Maggie Lady, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Maggie. It's a flavor, kind of a bouillon cube or a brand of seasonings that comes in West Africa. It's usually used as a bouillon cube. There's also a little sauce that's quite delicious, full of full of chemicals, but it's quite delicious. And that is very, very kind of widely used across social strata in Africa, certainly. And I was talking about this in the talk once, and someone was telling me that it's also quite common in Southeast Asia. And so the Maggie Lady, indexes not luxury, right? It's an everyday commodity that is used across all social classes, as I was saying. And importantly, this not luxury is mediated by women that are pictured in the campaign who are, I guess, fatter than the models, but who are never extremely thin. Let's put it that way. And there was a similar issue, like beyond body size, there was a similar issue around what was deemed acceptable in terms of age, right? In terms of the kind of the models, the consumers wanting older models and the company saying that, well, 30 is old in model years. You can't go past 30 and consider for who, for your model and consider yourself to be doing luxury. And so to me, what was being negotiated in these campaigns images were not just it was also the basic stuff about what are standards of beauty, kind of what bodies are deemed beautiful, the ways that women's bodies are, the particular ways that women's bodies are co-opted or kind of appropriated, and how value is extracted from women's bodies. But in addition to that, there's something going on here about Africanness and about Black African bodies. To me, the question that was in play here was, what did it take for Black African bodies to pass, right, to be acceptable as luxury, for these bodies to embody luxury or luxuriousness? And by way of luxury, to also belong or kind of be part of, right, belong to modernity. And so I use the term passing consciously or deliberately. In an American racial context, is defined as the successful but not necessarily intentional practice of representing oneself as a member of a racial group to which one is not conventionally understood to belong. And usually it's Black people passing as white. And it's a strategy deployed to access the social and economic advantages to which whiteness can facilitate access within the logic of white supremacy, a means of gaining access to spaces to that which one is denied access to. And I use passing here, in thinking about how Africanness is, or kind of these Black African women's bodies are, the work that they do in these ads, to highlight again the not only the performative but the kind of liminal and unstable dimensions of the women's staging in these campaigns, because there's something very unstable about passing, right? To the extent that one is always running the risk of being found out and to be shown to be out of place, out of their place. Now, I think it's worth noting that, kind of what I'm describing was playing out at a time when this new story of Africa was making headlines everywhere. And this is an Africa that was coming in from the margins, that was asserting itself, a new generation of Africans from the continent who had one foot on the continent and one foot in the global north typically, and who were intent on valorizing their cultural heritage. Everywhere you went, or everywhere, this notion that Africa was the future was quite popular at the time. To me, kind of what's going on with, in these VLSCO images is similar to something that was analyzed by the South African historian Hlonipa Mokoena in a chapter that's in this book, where she analyzes a campaign by Diesel in 2001. So this is before the Africa Rising moment. And this campaign puts forward African luxury, or rather Africans luxuriating, as a utopia, quite literally a world upside down. And you can see that, kind of, I don't know how well you can make it out, but in the newspaper headlines here, African expedition to explore unknown Europe by foot. Birth rate booms in Italy and Spain, Europe set back even further. European developing countries targeted by African tobacco industry, right? So kind of all of these headlines that we're used to seeing about Africa being applied to Europe instead, or kind of the places of Africa and Europe being switched. And the thing is that these images also set up Africans sort of in these joyful, luxuriating poses as part of this world upside down, right? It's part of a bright, new, as of yet unknown future. It's this fantasy. And so even as the images seem to offer a subversive image of African luxuriousness, Mokoena argues that the association of the new or the utopic with luxury or with the act of luxuriating relies on a false premise, right? That luxury has been unknown to African consumers prior to this moment, that is yet to come, or this moment we found ourselves on the cusp of. And so these would-be subversive images, in fact, reinforce existing stereotypes about basic African tastes, undiscriminating consumption, egalitarian societies, etc. And similar to the case in Mokwena's analysis, the rendering of this new Africa, this Africa rising in VLSCO's campaign images, was premised on an association of the old Africa as other to this new luxury, a luxury marked by not only the wearing of Western dress forms, but also by the bodies that can represent luxury and how they're pictured. Now, this was a campaign that I followed during my research. The photographers that were selected for the campaign were selected because of they're kind of like the big thing at that moment. And the images they created for the campaign were meant to fold and work with bodies in the same way that they had done for the Vogue Belgium campaign that they had recently shot. And so this idea of applying the same luxury aesthetic to African bodies or to Black bodies in order to sort of usher or mediate their entry into the global, that ultimately kind of reinforces these, kind of these equivalences, right, between young and thin as luxury and as new Africa, and older and fat as not luxury and old Africa, right, at the risk of kind of caricaturing it a little bit. Now, this misleading opposition or dichotomy was captured in the consumer categories that informed VLSCO's branding company. Though it featured 4 categories, the 2 dominant ones that were used for campaigns, or that informed campaigns and the different sets of images that were created, were the Afropolitan, or the global fashionista, and the traditionalist. And here you see the traditionalist, and they had little taglines. And so the traditionalist, the tagline for her in the kind of branding handbook was "Getting respect by meeting society's expectations." The global fashionistas was "My dog is named Gucci," to point to the fact that she is connected and connected to global luxury brands and sort of outward looking. And the thing is that the body size and age were also essential elements to how these 2 categories were constructed, with the global fashionista / Afropolitan being in her 20s and 30s, and then the traditionalist being kind of the global fashionista's mother, right? So being in late middle-aged and being fat. The depiction, or kind of the use of the Afropolitan in these branding campaigns, whether it's in VLSCO's or in others, because this, VLSCO here is really just one example of a dominant or a set of practices that were underway at the time more broadly. This depiction of the Afropolitan actually aligns with the way that the person who coined this term in 2005, the Nigerian, Ghanaian, British American writer Taye Selassie, articulated the category herself in this essay that she wrote in 2005, Bye Bye Babar, that has since become a classic. And it's worth quoting at length, and I put it on the screen here. The women show off enormous afros, tiny t-shirts, gaps in teeth. The scene is kind of this club, and she's describing the scene as a way of introducing this new kind of African. And I want to draw your attention here to the way that bodies are represented, the body size, place, right? So the women show off enormous afros, tiny t-shirts, gaps in teeth. The men, those incredible torsos unique to and common on African coastlines. And then, in the next paragraph, for you to ask any of these beautiful brown-skinned people the question, "Where are you from?" you'd get no single answer from a single smiling dancer. This one lives in London, but was raised in Toronto and born in Accra. That one works in Lagos, but grew up in Houston, Texas. Home for this lot is many things: where their parents are from, where they go for vacation, where they went to school, etc., etc. They read we are Afropolitans, the newest generation of African immigrants coming soon or collected already at a law firm, chem lab, jazz lounge near you. And so, as you can imagine, there's been a lot, and many of you are probably maybe familiar with this, but there's quite a lot of pushback to this depiction of this new African, right? And the critique being that this new African has to do with class, social mobility, wealth, ultimately. That this new African is certainly not that the Afropolitan, as defined here, distinguishes itself from other, certainly, African migrants, and or who we imagine when we think of African migrants, and that it points more to questions of wealth and class and social access and mobility than to any kind of new phenomenon, right? Any kind of this like sort of new Africa that is pointing to actually reifies class questions. And so, all this to say that the category that Afropolitan, as it was used by VLSCO, was actually consistent with categories that were often articulated by African people themselves in this moment of redefining Africa's place in the world. And so, to me, this question of who who can be depicted in VLSCO's campaigns is all the more significant when you consider that VLSCO's primary customers were women in advanced middle age and who were fat, because in West African, in many West African cultures, or larger women who are fat, or fatness is positively attributed, is positively valued, right? It's a positive attribute, especially in older middle age, because a sign of success, both material in terms of fertility, right? So for many reasons, fat female bodies are valued and associated with wealth, and VLSCO's textiles are a high-end product. So the people who would have the means to purchase these products would be older, fatter women. And so my point, here is that the bodies that are represented in the campaigns in the company's campaigns were the bodies were mapped onto this new Africa, which purported to reflect a different, more positive story of African being in the world. But the story, I contend, just reifies old dichotomies, right? It's not that this isn't something that VLSCO was just doing. These categories that they were using were circulating in popular discourse, and in the case of the Afropolitan, were sometimes, as I was saying, articulated by Africans themselves. What was happening at VLSCO at the time really was just one manifestation of a more widespread discursive current. So I want to zero in a little bit on this question of body size specifically, and the role it played in the negotiation of this boundary between center and margin, and in the kind of access to center. And for that, I want to focus on the Nana Benz of Togo. The Nana Benz are a cadre of businesswomen, wholesalers, who were a key component of Dutch waxcloth, and waxcloth more broadly, of the distribution of this textile throughout West and Central Africa, once the trade shifted from Ghana to Togo in the 1950s. The initial group of women built an oligopolistic structure passed down from mother to daughter, and that was extremely difficult for newcomers to integrate. Many of them came from kind of the economic elite at the time already in southern Togo. Now, along the way, these women earned the moniker Nana Benz, Nana being a term of respect for women elders in Mina, the main language, language in southern Togo. And Benz, because they came to be so wealthy from the trade of waxcloth that they purchased the first Mercedes Benzes in the country in the 1960s. And in the early days of independent Togo, they would lend their personal vehicles to the state for official visits from other heads of states. So the Nana Benz in Togo enjoy near mythical status. Such is their notoriety that a popular Togolese singer, King Mansa, wrote a song, an ode to them, titled Nana Benz, of which you see the lyrics here, which points again to this question of, it's point both to the way that the Nana Benz became part of the way sort of national Togolese identity, right? And the way they kind of lifted the country's name. But I think that the kind of the mobility that is captured in this song also is, or in these lyrics, are also important in the sense that the Nana carried the name of Togo across the world, and with that came both the status of the country and of the Nana. So there's this connection between mobility, a global mobility, and status or recognition. Now, the Nana played an important role in making Dutch waxcloth an iconic object through a range of practices. So there's the advertising, kind of the ways that they advertise the cloth had to do, or one of the techniques that they would use was naming the cloth, for instance, so that the names would be derived both from the designs of the cloth, but also sometimes the moment, right? Kind of what was happening in current events. Or it could be a song, it could be a proverb, ways to connect and anchor the cloth in a particular time that would ultimately make it a memory object. So for instance, during my fieldwork, it was a time when Nelson Mandela died, and one of the nanas that was one of my informants, had a design that she was about to bring to market, and she was going to call it something. She had a name set for it, but then when Nelson Mandela died, she was like, oh, I'm going to call it Madiba, which is Nelson Mandela's clan name, as a means of having it all of a sudden becoming sort of a historical memento, and thereby heightening its value. They also did things like creating artificial scarcity of certain designs in the market. They would have exclusivity. The different sort of nanas would have exclusive rights to sell particular designs, or particular designs in particular colors. And so they could regulate the amount of the number or the quantity of designs that was available on the market, and with that be able to play with the price and so on. Now, the nanas are fat. In Lomé, their body size marks their power, and their fatness is actually a positive attribute. It represents their wealth, both financially, and their body size, along with their cars and homes that they possess, represents their wealth. But as I was saying earlier, it also represents their reproductive wealth. Yeah, I think I can kind of leave it there. But then, as Nina Silvanos, who's an anthropologist, is discussed in a really nice analysis about how the Nana used their body to give a cloth. She explains that on one hand, the women would wear the cloth to advertise it, but the effect that process had was intimately tied to what their cloth meant in the space. And so the power, the prestige that their bodies held, right, the fatness of their bodies in this context was key to making waxcloth into the chiganva, the high value cloth that it would become. So the nanas are not without controversy in Togo, right? Their exclusionary control of the market has been the source of resentment among other would-be market entrants, as has been, and their relationship to political power, in particular to Togo's longtime dictator, Gnassingbé Eyadema, was complicated, to say the least. It was often deemed opportunistic by some. It was considered a betrayal by others. And so they're complicated women, right? Now, when I talk about the Nana Benz while discussing my research outside of Togo, be it in the US or in Europe, they're always a hit. And my interlocutors tend to find their story delightful. And there's always a chuckle that comes when I explain the Benz of, the Nana Benz. And I've been curious about this reaction, kind of the delight and amusement that the Nana Benz evoke. From the statements I usually follow in these conversations, usually it's a mix of admiration for these women and what they were able to achieve. Here they're pictured with executives from VLSCO in the 80s, I want to say, in Helmond. So usually in these conversations I have, as I explain this, who they are, why they're called Nana Benz, there's then kind of this admiration and surprise about these African women millionaires in the 1960s. And I've been kind of trying to understand what this amusement or this delight about these women is. And I think it's that there's something that feels subversive about them, that them being powerful, economically and politically powerful. But the thing is that, I think the nanas are all but subversive. I mean, we could debate this, right? But in many ways, they're not that subversive. I mean, they're quite, ruthless capitalists or very close to established power in terms of their relationship to the dominant political regime. But I think sort of part of what feels unexpected and surprising about them has to do with how they render visually. The fact that they don't match white Western visions of modernity or of wealth. And to me, this ties to an experience I've often had also with regards to the Nana Benz, which is that when I was doing research at VLSCO, I often heard them referred to as the Mama Benz. And at first it took me a while, but I was like, wait, no, I kept hearing it. And I was like, that's really weird. Like, these are huge. Like, they were, the biggest partners of the company in terms of bringing in millions and millions of dollars. And yet they were being misnamed. And their name, the moniker, the name that they've earned is absolutely Nana Benz, but they kept being referred to as Mama Benz. And and so I guess, you tell me what you think. But to me, there's a kind of a slippage, right? The slip of the tongue here is not insignificant, because I think it points back to kind of what these women can be imagined as, right? Imagined as mama. Even, and I think this is something that I heard a lot of VLSCO, but that also comes up in conversations with non-Africans. Sort of this mama figure keeps coming back, and to me, it goes back to this point about what these women could be seen as, and that being tied very much to them, quite literally, what they could be seen as visually, how they render visually in terms of their body size, in terms of their age, in terms of their dress. So a number of scholars have noted, how Black women's bodies have been read in excess. And Sabrina String's recent book extends on this work by laying out how fatness became or how slenderness came to be read as a marker of moral, racial, and national superiority in Europe and in the United States in the late 19th century. And how fatness, became fatness became associated with Blackness and became part of this racial discourse along which these distinctions could be established between elite Europeans and white Americans on one end, and as she puts it, the so-called greedy and fat racial others. And so to me, similarly to the kind of the images at the, on the walls or in the advertising campaigns at VLSCO, the subversiveness or the surprise of the Nana Benzes story rests on an enduring association of global belonging and social mobility with young, thin bodies. All right, so my wind down, kind of where to from here? So as I was saying, I'm doing this work on reparative justice now, and I've started teaching a course on contemporary movements for reparations for slavery and colonialism. And in this class, we've been talking about how colonialism reshapes space and bodies in space, how it invisibilizes or renders invisible certain bodies, pushes them out of the frame, effectively renders these bodies out of place. And we've been thinking about the contemporary legacies of this ordering of space and of bodies in space, and what it means to pursue justice and repair for the harms done. As I was preparing for today's talk, I realized that the work that we're doing in this class dovetails quite nicely with my concerns here also. Because after all, what I've talked about is how the Black African women along the path of Dutch waxcloth between the Netherlands and Togo are absented, how their presence is conditional, and how categories of being, African, Afropolitan, global, modern, how these categories are being articulated through the spaces that these bodies are made to occupy or not. What I wanted to get at in this talk is what makes some bodies imaginable as part of modernity or of the global. What would it take to think women like the Nana Benz and like, our grandmothers on equal footing or as belonging to the global? And this is it's an enduring question, but it's an old question, but it's one that endures. And, in that I've found the work of critical geographers, for instance, like Laura Pulido, particularly useful for the ways that it emphasizes never losing sight of the racial logics that underpin the capitalist economic system that have shaped the modern world, and never losing sight of how the legacies of colonialism and slavery continue to shape and inform who occupies what space, who has access to what resources, who can lay claim to these resources, who counts, etc. And so I hope that kind of what my analysis has pointed to is sort of the one illustration of the enduring racial logics that guard the gates of inclusion to into full society. And so, how do we move from kind of this being disappeared or absented? Where to from here? Is inclusion or belonging really the goal? Because at first I was thinking, okay, from being disappeared to belonging. And then the more I think about this literature on reparative justice, the more I actually don't think belonging is the point. And I'll tell you why. So the thing is that projects for repair, for historical redress are often framed or read or understood as backward-looking projects, right? Projects that look toward the past. But in fact, when you look at them closely, they're theorized and undertaken absolutely as forward-looking projects, right? It's addressing the past in order to create a different and better future and present. And what this literature comes back to again and again is the fact that repair for these historical harms, harms that so profoundly structured current realities, right? And harms that were not egregious, but rather harms that were facilitated or condoned or foundational, right, to dominant political and economic power structures. Given these harms, repair has to be transformative, right? It's not about restoring anything that was, it has to be about creating something new. And so a lot of this work, kind of the theorizing of this work, so this is a book that just came out by a Nigerian-American philosopher, Olufemi Taiwo, about kind of, and his argument is that there needs to be kind of a constructive view to reparations that is not just about repairing harms, it's not just about restoring relationships, but it's really about creating a new order, a new set of a new political and economic order. And so in this view, kind of reparations projects become projects of imagination, right? Imagination actually becomes an important strategy. And so I was thinking about that to act off and thinking about, well, what would that mean? And I'll tell you right now, like I don't have an answer, but kind of what would it mean to transform existing structures? And this is all the more important when we see the ways that some of these discourses, like I was pointing to the Afropolitan example or to the Africa Rising or Africa is the Future, a lot of these images and discourses were actually being articulated by African people themselves as a means of sort of negotiating, kind of saying Africa is not an outsider anymore. And so kind of, but my point here is that it actually just, the way it's done actually just reifies these old dichotomies. And so I don't know, so for me, this thing about imagination as a practice of liberation, as Ruha Benjamin, who's a science and technology studies scholar, comes to mind. And she points to Octavia Butler, who's for those of you into science fiction, kind of considered one of the most important science fiction writers, and certainly one of the most notable African-American, one of very few and most notable African-American science fiction writers. And she talks about radio imagination, the kind of imagination that hears the groans of bondage that echo whenever and wherever liberty rings. So imagination that is both able to, or that is built on hearing what is in order to create something new. And so Ruha Benjamin keeps calling us back to this practice of imagining the worlds that we want to live in. And I love this quote, and I will end with this, where she says, look at reality squarely, and then find a round room to craft alternative realities. And to me, this is a really poignant quote for the way that it calls for both recognizing sort of these profound, enduring, challenging realities, or kind of legacies, right? And sort of the ways that they structure our world today, and coming up with finding a round to the square, like coming up with a completely different way of organizing things. All right, so I will stop there. I'm sorry I went a little bit longer than planned, but I hope we have plenty to talk about.
Thanks, Amah. It was really fantastic. I mean, I regret that we cannot properly applaud you, like if you were with us, but it was really amazing. I think I can just open the floor, and you can raise all sorts of questions. You can do, I think it's nicer if you just raise your hand and you talk, but otherwise you can also use the chat. I know Amah likes to see people, rather, but yeah, let's see. If there's any question. And if I can break the ice, I mean, there are many things in the sense that there are many things that I learned. There are many things that we share. Like I totally agree with everything you said at the end about reparation, the way reparation should be understood. And I really like the way in which you portray, you frame this whole discourse on the history of the African walks or Dutch walks as an example of, I mean, the complex entanglement and paradoxes that shape contemporary global Africanness, in the sense that on the one hand, you have like a global brand who's trying to tell a new story about Africa, and this new story ends up being full of old prejudice and old stereotypes. But on the other hand, it's not just this white story conceived for Black. It's also a story in which Black people plays a role, not just because they're buying, but also because they are mediating. I think about the Nana bands. So you can see that it's not just about color lines that clearly divide Black and white. I mean, of course, color lines plays a role. There are racial divides, there are class divides, there are cultural divides, but it's not so easy to say that it's just something done by white elite versus or toward or vis-a-vis Black people. It's much more complex, and I guess absolutely. Like the Mama bands are also, the Nana bands, sorry, are also an example of this sort of, I don't know, kind of broker figure that mediate, and they're business women, so they're not like the poor Africans at all, and they're part of this circuit. That said, I have a very simple, I mean, first, very stupid question. Why men are completely out of the picture, in the sense that men also were, and so I'm wondering, like VLSCO, I remember very well what you were talking about, because I was living in Paris for a long time, too long time, in the 18th arrondissement that you were mentioning. So I've seen like changing, like the traditional African shops, and then the defensive VLSCO things that started to open with a lot of different, products and designs. But I also know that, I mean, historically, the men wear Watts clothes. I mean, I don't know if it's still called pagne, like that's again.
Yeah.
The French version, so I was wondering why they're completely out of the picture, not just of your picture, but of the VLSCO picture. I'm wondering if there's any specific reason. Yeah. And then, that would be my first question, and then I have more again, but specific to understand, because I don't know a lot of this story. I mean, I've seen a lot of works, but I don't know a lot of.
No, thank you. I mean, I cut out a lot about the sort of how the cloth is used and what it means and all of that. So thank you for raising this question. And thank you for the way it's so nice to have someone else kind of read your work and be like, yes, these are the basic dynamics. It's like you're in it, you're so entangled. So thank you for reframing it in these terms. Men in the story. So yes, absolutely. Men wear the cloth, right? Also, and in fact, one of the ways that the cloth is worn is to mark kinship, right? So that whether it's familial ties or other forms of kinship, but like, so you'll buy fabric and share it and wear it with your partner, your kids, or as part of a bridal party or whatever. The thing about the cloth, so there's maybe a 2 or 3 part answer to your question. So one is that it is part, in West Africa and Togo in particular, it's part of female wealth specifically, right? So it's something that women, that women own and women amass, well, women who can, right, amass over a lifetime. It's part of the how do you call it? inheritance, right, that you will leave your daughter, like jewelry in some cultures. And so it's part of the bride wealth. So when you're getting married, your husband brings gifts of cloth, a certain design, certain quantity to you and to your family, to your mother, or your also, that becomes sort of, it's a marker, it shows that your husband is capable of taking care of you. And it becomes a foundation of kind of a collection that you will build over the course of your life. And so it's female wealth, and so but then women are purchasing it themselves, right? And in fact, in many cases now, with the kind of the economic crisis that is facing many West African countries, oftentimes women, like during my research, there are these cases of where the men couldn't afford to buy the fabrics, and when the women would buy it themselves, give it to the man to give to them for their ceremony, right? Or like borrow it for someone to give to them. So it's so that's one way in which it's kind of this this female wealth on the consumption end. But then also the sellers have been women historically, right? Like the Nana Benz and their whole network of traders have been women because of the nature of commerce in southern Togo, where this is women's work for this cloth. That's another part. But then men do wear it. And so it actually, one of the older designers in the studio when I was doing my research brought up exactly your point. She's like, well, it kind of bums me out that we don't see men in the advertising campaign anymore. But I think it was part of this rebranding as fashion, where before, if you're a textile manufacturer, you're making cloth and, sort of what happens downstream from it, whatever bodies wear it, different bodies wear it, whatever. But once you start telling or wanting to tell a story about yourself in the world, and that story has to do with, like kind of the image that VLSCO was wanting to put forward of itself was as a fashion brand, and given that women were the primary consumers, at least in Africa. I think there's multiple parts of it. I think that was part of it. So like putting women forward. But I think also the way that the cloth gets used in Africa, in West Africa, is not the way that it would get used in the global market. So I think, I don't think you would see, a couple walking hand in hand wearing matching outfits, and that being cool. Maybe we'll get there in Paris, or, like, let's say a white couple wearing something like that in Paris, so that wouldn't work, right? So it was like kind of translating it from the West African modes of usage into something that would be legible in a European fashion landscape that also feminized it in the way that it was branded.
Sorry, no, I always have trouble unmuting myself. Thanks a lot, Amah, for your answer. I'll have more questions, but I'll first leave it to, I guess, Michelle and then Ching Hong. Michelle first.
Okay, you can hear me well enough? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, well, I live in the Netherlands, and I saw this exhibition that was in Helmand, and I cannot remember the name of the Nigerian artist, but he had like in a bottle, a ship.
Yinka Shonibare.
Yes,
Yes.
who unfortunately was paralyzed, but he was able to take the material, and he dressed dolls, and like in sort of, he put them back in time, if you recall, like in a French kind of very what would you call it, a prestigious, elaborate setting. And I was quite impressed by that. And I thought, this is very interesting how the post-colonial, the Dutch, the way they were in Indonesia, from what I understood, how it has gone all around the world. And maybe that ship symbolizes that in
Absolutely.
The bottle.
Yeah.
Because it was taken from the batik, from what I understood, which actually originally came from China. Then they used this batik process, and the Dutch were smart. They put it in African women were the ones mainly that were the ones who wanted to purchase. So it's just very interesting how it has, from history. But then again, you have what they call cultural appropriation. And I read that, for instance, in the United States, like the Navajos, because you're a cultural anthropologist, they don't like the geometric motifs being used on clothing. Now, what about with this in Africa? Because I don't know if the motives are used. It's mainly the bright colors. Why? Maybe you could explain why this appeals. Why it has such an appeal to the Africans? Something that the technique has come from Indonesia.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Can you explain why it is caught on?
Yeah.
And what kind of repercussions it might have for
Yeah.
the society?
Yes, thank you for raising this. This is another piece that I usually include that I didn't include, but sort of a little bit about this or the historical background. As you mentioned, exactly. So this is a technique that was, the Indonesian hand-printed batik technique that was mechanized by European manufacturers, originally in view of being sold to Indonesian, like on Indonesian markets, but then that ended up sort of the cloth that was produced by the machines was less precise. The designs that were printed were less precise than the kind that would be drawn by hand or that would be printed by hand. And so actually were less valued on Indonesian markets. But because the Dutch were involved in, trade all along the West African coast, these textiles that they were producing were some of the textiles that absolutely. Yeah. So some of these textiles that were being were some of the commodities that were being traded, and so there are different sort of kind of theories about how it kind of the cloth was taken up. One was that there was aesthetic resonance between these batiks and sort of the textiles that were being produced in West Africa at the time, sort of indigo, resist dye textiles and so on. And so just that West African consumers liked it, like that it looked, it was something appealing, and that also resonated with local tastes at the time. Another is that some of the Ghanaian soldiers who'd been enlisted who had been enlisted, I don't know if that's even the right term to use, but who had fought for the Dutch and who had come back to Ghana, had brought some of this textile back, who had fought for the Dutch in Indonesia or in the East Indies, had then brought this textile back to Ghana, and that was another mode of introduction to it. But then eventually the thing is that the trade started, or the manufacture of the cloth started being directed or done specifically in for West African markets, right? So that the aesthetic started being the VLSCO and other European manufacturers started doing research on what West African consumers liked and started trying to figure out how to speak or write or draw to those tastes, right? And so what Yinka Shonibare does is in his work, is, as you said, he has these massive mannequins that he dresses and sort of, this is like what century is it? I think it's like the 19th century that he's I think
17th maybe, or 18th century.
I think it's the 18th century.
Yeah.
But these massive gowns, and then the ships and so on. And so his point was to kind of draw out, to make visible these colonial ties, and also playing on the incongruity of the image, right? So seeing these forms that we associate with European dress, and then putting them in African, but then cutting them out of this cloth that we read as African print cloth, to show the ways this entanglements, right, and the endurance of the legacies again of slavery, of colonialism, and the ways that they live on today, in ways that are not visible, because this cloth, you see it, you think you're like, oh, it's an African thing, and you don't know sort of the histories behind it. So that's part of the visibility that Yinka Shonibare's work is after, in the way that he uses wax cloth, which he purchases in Brixton.
That's right, I saw it in London when I was there. Yes,
right, it's a whole thing. And I think in terms of and so just one last thing, just in terms of thinking about the uptake of this cloth and how we think about appropriation, I think. This is another question that comes up all the time. And my answer is that appropriation in and of itself is not a problematic thing, right? Like appropriation of, right? Like it's like you take up a thing, you make it yours.
Yeah, it seems natural.
Right. The political issue around, or the political question around cultural appropriation, like the way it's used in the US, namely, and you mentioned the Navajo example, is when this uptake of cultural forms is kind of happens hand in hand with devaluing or absenting or erasing of the folks and the cultures that are at the origin of these forms. You see what I mean? So like it's one thing to take up something, name and value, and kind of recognize, give due credit to where it comes from, and
it should be due credit. Yes.
Understand how it's used, understand, kind of treat it, do due diligence around it. And it's another to take it up in a way that devalues and that continues to marginalize or appropriates in the sense of erasing and naming or claiming as one's own. That's where all the
so attitude is the key. It's very important that you do this in a certain way and not
Yeah,
where you would not give credit to where credit's due.
absolutely.
The
And sometimes,
designer.
yeah, and sometimes doing due diligence leads to not using that thing, right? Like sometimes once you run through that analysis, the end point is, yeah, I probably shouldn't wear that.
Yeah.
That might not be a good thing. Sometimes, yeah, and I don't think it's always a blanket issue, but I think this is like these are the questions I need to be part of.
That's the ethical part, I guess,
exactly.
that also enters into what you're also your what do you call it, reparative justice. But there's this ethical thing as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. And wearing the clothing that feels more like you don't want to be into passing. You want to actually take pride in your culture when you wear this. You see? So there's a big difference when you mention passing. No, and it's just the opposite of passing, isn't it?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, you want to flaunt your,
Thanks, Michelle, for your question, and thanks, Amah, for replying.
Thank you very much for your answer. A very wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
There is another question. Qinghong, yes, you can.
Oops, we can't hear you.
Yeah, mute. Yeah.
Thank you for your wonderful lecture. And I'm from China, and when I read the article and found that finally it is said that the wax cloths of Nana Benz now are made in China. So I'm, surprised to see that. But anyhow, I know in China we also have a long tradition of wax cloth production. And also in your lecture I found some similarities, because right now in China the television, the central television also provide us with some kind of TV programs like New Africa. Some kind of, the development of the African countries. So we both are the developing countries. And so I found some similarities in your lecture. For example, the pictures you shown somewhat like the older generation women and the new generation women. It's just almost the same kind of thing in China. Very similar, except that the black people, that the black face, black skin, just turn to the yellow one. Also, like the photographers, the pictures of the model, I think almost exactly the same kind of thing in China. And we can see the kind of influences of the Western world upon the women, especially about the kind of the kind of beauty, standard of beauty, with fat or thinness. Now, I think this also kind of questions, confronted by Chinese women, especially nowadays. So this kind, post-colonial, discourse, the kind of influences, I think it's really a kind of thing that we, as the developing countries, people in developing countries, especially women, have to fight against.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that. And you introduced, so I love this. You guys are bringing up all the things. I was like, oh, great. I don't have time to put this in the talk, but we'll see. And this is all the things, because China is the other kind of big pull, right? So the other places I didn't talk about were, Indonesia, and then certainly, and China, because most of the cloth on African markets today is produced in China. Like VLSCO is this much. And in fact, VLSCO's rebranding was spurred by the entry of Chinese-made cloths on West African markets, which all of a sudden really compromised the monopoly that they held on West African markets, and they had to think beyond the continent. And so this is what precipitated everything. And the ways that China comes up in many interesting ways. So I love, I love that you're highlighting kind of the parallels, kind of between the Chinese experience and maybe the Togolese, other African experiences. But then China also plays kind of this triangulating role in two ways. One is today in China is seen as kind of the new colonizer of African countries in some respects, right? And so the power dynamic there, and the parallel that's often made is that kind of the rush for African resources by China mirrors the rush for African resources by European countries, even as China sets itself up as a counterpoint to European and American power and saying, we're just here to do business. There's none of that political history and legacy. It's less messy. We're just here to do business. Blah, blah, blah. But it's also a very contested field politically, right? But then in addition to that, the way it came up at VLSCO was that one of the pushbacks that the kind of management would have when people would raise these questions of the colonial legacy, or like, well, China's no better, like China is also like this cloth is coming from China. One, it's like the Chinese made stuff. It's not made in Africa. And China also has this very complicated political relationship with African countries today. Why isn't anyone giving the Chinese manufacturers a hard time? Right? Like this was kind of, and I think, my answer to that would be because that it kind of like that European, kind of the European colonial history and colonial ties is like, the two don't have to be mutually exclusive, right? It's not because Europe colonized or European countries colonize Africa that we can't talk about China. It's not because China is currently involved in the continent that we can't talk about Europe. Both of these forms of colonialism or resources extraction are absolutely tied and relevant to the ways to kind of how we think about the work that this cloth is doing and what it means to people, to African consumers. But I think in terms of the, what to make of the fact that what you're describing about the, how models, the ways, the uptake of sort of white dominant standards and the performance as a way to negotiate access or like kind of belonging. Like I think it can be linked to the discussion about sort of like the post-racial moment in a way that, I don't know if you all, how familiar you all are with this, but like discussion around Beyonce, for example, right? And sort of like this idea that Beyonce has transcended Blackness because Beyonce is, I see all the smirks on your screen, on your faces, but the fact that she has transcended race by virtue of becoming this global icon, or the fact that once we had Barack Obama in the US, remember those days when we thought we transcended race because Obama was elected? But so like all of these things are like, that they're, in the case of Beyonce, that wealth, right, or that kind of fitting a particular ideal allows you to actually shed your racial identity, or you're no longer seen as Black somehow, right? That to me is similar to what we see playing out at a larger scale here, right? The idea that like if we can, and I say we as Black African, if we can just fit, if we can make ourselves fit, if we can sort of fit this image of what it means to be a part of visual, like, and this is visual, it's like if we can create these images, we get to retell our story and repaint and kind of write ourselves and draw ourselves into these stories in a way that we hope, like the goal here is to do away, is to kind of break away from these histories, right? From these legacies. That's really all that people are after. Like folks just trying to get free, right? But how do you get free? That's the question. And I think it's very tempting, and this is what we see a lot of, to just sort of adopt these new standards and just make them, just put Black bodies in there and be like, hey, we're here. And my point is that Black or non-white bodies, right? It can be like any other kind of non-white group. But my point is that, in fact, we just keeps reinforcing those standards. So what does it mean to think outside of that? Like, and I honestly don't know, but what does it mean to come up with to create a new order that challenges these underlying categories and hierarchies? That I think is the task.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Amah. We have a couple of minutes, but then we'll have to close the session. I don't know if there are other questions. I have some curiosity about the way you conduct your fieldwork, because it seems like you spent quite some time in Helmand and then also in Togo, but I'm not sure exactly who were like the informants that you've been engaging with. That would be my curiosity.
Thank you.
I don't know if there are other questions. Otherwise, I will try to. I will ask you to satisfy my curiosity first.
Yes, so it was fieldwork that I conducted over about 1.5 years, and this was when multi-sided ethnography was sort of the new thing, and it's still kind of the big thing. But actually, I don't know. I haven't hung out with grad students recently, so I don't know what folks are doing. They're talking about a lot these days, but maybe more multi-species. But so the idea, I got lucky. I came to the Netherlands in 2011 first to see if I could meet people, and I met a number of folks like Anne-Marie Mol at UvA and Rachel Spronk and like a few other folks who kind of helped connect me. And eventually I ended up at VLSCO somehow, and I was in the archives for a while, and I had been emailing the creative director and just wasn't hearing back. And then he happened to come in one day when I was in the archive, and he was really he's like, oh, anthropologist, cool. I studied anthropology and fashion. Love it. Come do work with us. So I really got lucky being there. And then they granted me access. So I was in the archives, and they granted me access to the design studio and then to the branding department. And so I spent 3-4 months in Helmand in the studio with the designers. And then while I was there, they were in the process of preparing a collection that would be released I think it was like 1.5 years later. And so I was able to follow the creation of those designs, and then the branding department, as they were creating their images, I spent like about 3 months there also. And again, I got lucky because the designers were going to be going on a research trip to West Africa during my time there, where they were going to Benin, Togo, and Ghana. And I was able to follow them. And for me, it was really, both for research, it was amazing to kind of be with them as they're kind of encountering this space. And some of them, it was their first time in Africa. And so kind of like this thing about, well, what does this mean? What does Africa stand for? What does it look like? What do they capture? How does it translate into their creative process? It was amazing. And then for me personally, I hadn't been back to Togo in 25 years. So it was me re-encountering my home country also alongside, these designers. So it was really a charged period. But then in Togo, my research was with, so at the VLSCO boutique in Lomé, where they sold these fabrics. This was a new thing. The boutique was, because before it would just get sold in the market in these stalls, but the boutique was part of the rebranding. And so I hung out there a lot, just sort of watching kind of what this new space did and how selling happened and how the cloth was engaged with, et cetera. And also spent time with sellers at the market, which at the time was in a massive crisis. So there wasn't much activity. And then I hung out with tailors also who were working this fabric to see how materially the fabric was given value, right? And there's a whole thing about cutting it and not cutting it, and this whole other conversation, how you maintain the cloth's value, because it's Dutch wax cloth specifically is considered so valuable that you're supposed to not cut it. So traditionally, customarily, the way the 3-piece outfit is done is that the skirt is sewn in such a way that you don't cut it. You fold the fabric into it so that as your body changes, you can adjust it. And then later you can also undo it, and you have 2 yards of fabric that you can reuse, right? And the blouse is the part that's cut in 2 yards. And then the other 2 yards is for the head or for babies. So you actually manage to keep 4 of 6 yards intact, right? And then your daughter can then take it and do what she wants with it and so on, right? So, but then now there's a new way that you perform status by cutting it and making something frivolous that you can wear one time because you have the means to do that. And so there's a whole debate about, or kind of negotiation of like, what do you do with this cloth at the level of tailoring also? And so over the course of the 1.5 years, I was sort of following these different practices between the Netherlands and Togo. And as an anthropologist, sort of my body and my embodied experience was a critical part of sort of how I was making sense and how I was reading and the data that I was collecting, let's say, in this process.
Thanks, Amah. And I know, you feel like you're done with that, in the sense that it was your previous research and you're moving towards something else, but still, to me, like, sounds really, really amazing. So Yeah.
Thank you.
So I would like to thank you first, but we have a plan. So it's not just that, it's not goodbye, Amah. We said you're gonna come to Utrecht, in person, and we're gonna do the launch of the African Action Future Lab. And I also would like to thank all of you for being here, attending this lecture. So we'll have a good evening, everybody. And again, Amah, really thank you.
Thank you all so much. I really
Thank
appreciate it. And thank you for the invitation again, Jamila.
And
I hope to see you all in person.
Yeah, sorry. No, I was just suggesting that we unmute ourselves and we can upload, because I always found it nice.
Yeah.
And it's so that we cannot do that.
Thank you. See you back in the Netherlands.
Thank you. Yes, I look forward to being back
so
also.
much.
All right.
Thank
Take
you.
good care.
Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.